Oh, hi there. Who's got two thumbs and is about to refinish this staircase? This guy.
In this video, I'll be going over my process for finishing a staircase. That includes staining and polyurethaning the treads, then priming and painting the risers and stringers. You may also hear stringers referred to as skirt boards, but the only people that care about the difference are carpenters, so whatever. Moving on. Before we get to staining the treads, we've got a little bit of prep we need to do. It's a good idea to use a respirator. You're going to need some sandpaper. I like 220 for this process. You can also use 150 if your stairs are a little bit rougher. And then you will also need some mineral spirits and some rags. So the first step in the prep process is to sand the treads, and you want to go with the grain. And really what you're doing is kind of sanding off any debris or dirt that may have accumulated on those treads. And it's also just prepping the wood and the grain to take the stain. When I'm doing this process, after I'm done sanding, I usually run the shop vac over the treads just to vacuum up any dust that I've created. And then for this next part, you really want to make sure you're using a respirator, and you can use gloves too if you wish. And then what you're going to do is soak a rag in mineral spirits or paint thinner, doesn't really matter which one, pretty much both the same thing. And then you want to wipe down those treads, the entirety of the treads over the whole surface so that it looks wet. What that's going to do is just clean the treads and then open up that grain to receive the stain. Now that the treads have been prepped, they're ready for the staining and polyurethaning process, and we will need some additional supplies for that. For this particular staircase, I went with both stain and polyurethane from Czar, Black Caviar Interior Oil-Based Stain, and then I went with their Interior Oil-Based Fast Dry Polyurethane in the satin finish. And something pretty cool, at least to me, is that I've been using Czar stain and polyurethane for over a decade, and actually I made a video on this process a year or two ago, and Czar saw that video and then reached out not too long ago saying, you know, if I would like some free product for my next stain job. So I was like, heck yeah.
It's free real estate.
So they sent me the stain and the polyurethane and I believe the wood filler for this project. And even if they didn't, this is exactly what I would use and recommend to use anyway. Along with the stain and polyurethane, you're also going to need a brush, rags, respirator, and gloves. One little side note I wanted to mention that tends to be a sticking point for this process is finding a good stain for matching the rest of the wood in the room. On a project like this, I was matching the treads to the existing hardwood floors. One of the things that happened in this house is there's new flooring put in, and we want to match the treads to the flooring, but thankfully I have some offcuts from the carpenters that are similar to what's been put down, and so that's the best way I've found to match stain is to run your stain onto an offcut and then compare it to the floor. You have to imagine how it's going to look with coats of polyurethane, but I've actually done this combo before with this floor and I'm very confident that it's going to work out well. So now it's actually time to apply the stain to the tread. You want to stir the stain up a little bit, make sure you incorporate all the solids that may have settled to the bottom of the can, and then you can either pour that in an edging container or go straight out of the can. For the Czar stain specifically, I like using a brush to lay it down. It doesn't super matter what kind of brush. Someone was giving me crap in the comments the other day about how I messed up because I should be applying stain with a rag or whatever. Just to be clear, on the Czar stain, it goes on very much like a paint, and even on the back of the can for application, it says you can use a cloth or a brush to lay it down. And I have found it to be super useful to use a brush. I just have way more control over it. And then when I'm laying the stain down on the treads, I do 3 to 4 treads at a time, and you want it to be a little bit oversaturated with stain, because what's going to happen is the wood is going to take as much stain as it's going to take, and then the kind of residual leftover will sit on top. By the time I do 3 or 4 treads, the first tread that I did is ready to be wiped off. And what I'm going to do is use a rag to wipe down all the excess. Be aggressive as you rag it off. Generally, you're going to go with the grain as well. That helps push the stain down into the grain and just makes it look super nice. And then you just don't want any puddles of stain or thick spots to be left on top, because that'll look weird when you go to do your polyurethane. I also want to do a quick public service announcement about what to do with your rags that you're using to wipe off the stain and the ones that you use to lay down the mineral spirits. You want to put those in a bucket with water in it. I knew a dude that set his truck on fire and a dumpster on fire twice, so just be really careful with what you're doing with those rags. Even if you put it in a trash bag, try and wet them down before you do that, and don't put it in a super hot place or it might set your shit on fire. Now that the treads are stained, they are ready for polyurethane. I like doing 3 coats of polyurethane, and I'll kind of talk through what I do between each coat. So for polyurethaning, I used the Fast Dry oil-based poly from Vassar as well in the satin finish, which is what I really like using. And I laid it down with a 2.5-inch Corona Vegas brush. A lot of times I just go straight out of the can like I did in this video, but you can also go out of an edging container if you wish. And when you lay down the polyurethane, I like going with the grain and just doing a full even coat on the tread, and make sure you get that bull nose as well. Make sure you're running the polyurethane into each corner so you're getting a nice even coating on that whole surface. I start at the top of the steps and work my way down, and then we're going to give that polyurethane a couple hours to dry. The Fast Dry does tend to dry within 2 hours, just depending on drying conditions and humidity and things like that. So after I laid down that first coat of poly, I'm going to let that dry for a couple hours. The Fast Dry poly does tend to dry in about 2 hours, but you just want to make sure it's okay to go up and down on. And as I'm working on the second coat, I'm generally always in sock feet, and I'm usually already in sock feet at this point. You just don't want your shoes marring the surface as you're going up and down the steps. After the first coat of polyurethane is dry, that's when I use wood filler to fill the nail holes in the treads. In this video, I used the Vassar dark tone wood filler, and I don't believe they make it anymore, and it's been somewhat difficult to find ones that work well. I know Minwax makes some as well, but if you're looking at the tinted wood fillers, I'd highly recommend going darker than you think is necessary. Those tend to look the best. What happened on this particular project is I used the dark tone wood filler from Vassar to fill all the holes, and then when it dried, it was very obvious where that wood filler was, and I just knew it was not going to look great if I just kept putting polyurethane over top of it. So what I did is I got the stain back out, and I just dabbed stain on each of the filled spots. And then just let that sit for a second. And because the polyurethane had already been applied to the tread wasn't going to take any more of the stain, just the wood-filled spots. So then I ragged that off, and then it looked great. It looked exactly how I'd want it to look if I had used an even darker wood filler, which is what I'd recommend doing in the first place. And on that note, let's throw it back to Jeremy in the field with a word of wisdom about when to address issues in your polyurethaning staining process as early on in the process as you can. So once I got the wood filler issue taken care of and everything was looking how I wanted it to, it was time to lay down the second coat of polyurethane. So just light sand with the grain, and then I'll rag that off with a rag just to get all the dust off, and then start laying down my poly again. And so again, working from the top down, and do another nice even coat of polyurethane. I'll let that dry, and then before I do the third and final coat, I do another light sand with 220, same deal as before, and then I laid down the third and final coat of polyurethane. So now we're at the home stretch of the process, and this is always my favorite part of these jobs because it means that I'm very close to just being able to paint, which is more of my jam. We're ready to paint the risers and the stringers, and we're going to need some supplies for that as well. You're going to need some primer, brushes, caulk and a caulk gun, wood filler, and then your finish paint. And I'll talk about all those as we go through them. Big shift in the process for us, and for me particularly, is switching over to using Fresh Start Primer from Benjamin Moore. This is a super awesome product. I couldn't be more stoked about it. Before, if you watched any of my other videos where I've done something similar, a lot of times I ended up using either cover stain or bin shellac on the risers because you have the stain and poly that ran up on the risers and stringers from doing the treads. So a lot of times to seal that in, you would use an oil-based product so that you don't get any bleed through, but not anymore. I'm super happy with it because it's 100% acrylic, very nice to work with. The fumes aren't bad at all. So as you're watching me do in this video, I laid down the Fresh Start Primer with a 2.5-inch Corona Cortez on the risers and stringers. That's generally the first thing I do in this part of the process. After I do that, then I'm going to caulk the gap between the riser and the stringer. And generally, I don't ever caulk between the tread and the stringer or the riser. I just don't think that that looks the best. And I used Powerhouse caulk from Sherwin-Williams, which is kind of our go-to jam for this type of thing. Once the caulking's done, I move on to filling any nail holes that may be in the risers. And you can just use regular wood filler. I use the orange stuff from Sherwin-Williams. That's kind of our go-to as well. Once the wood filler dries, Just sand that down, and then we're ready to start painting the risers and the stringers. Before we get too far along in the painting process, I did want to acknowledge that if you're doing this project yourself, you can tape those treads out. I'd recommend using yellow frog tape, and you can get really nice lines with the yellow frog tape, particularly if you're using Fresh Start and you're not using a primer like Bin Shellac or Cover Stain that tends to seep back behind the tape and give you problems. The trim paint I selected for this project is Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel and Semi-Gloss. That's our go-to trim paint currently. Generally, the pattern I pick is I'll do one stringer first from the top down, and then I'll do the riser and the other side of the stringer. Or sometimes I'll do both stringers first and then do the riser last. Again, you just work from the top down, and what I've found is that once you do a full coat and have worked your way from the top down, it's generally ready to go again almost as soon as you get to the bottom because of just how long it takes to paint. And then when I'm painting the risers, you're going to paint using horizontal strokes that are going with the grain. That tends to look the best and just gives you your most uniform looking finish. As you can see in the after shots, this one turned out pretty sweet. Now that you've seen the stair portion of this job, you might be wondering how I went about painting those sweet handrails and spindles. You can sate your curiosity by watching this video right here. Some stuff actually went a little bit wrong on that one, but we got there in the end.